we may have to adjust the way we deal with both in regards to such a sensitive issue as NATO, for different reasons in each case. In the case of Ukraine, because there is no consensus in Ukraine regarding joining NATO, and because the leadership is profoundly divided and unable to shape a consistent national policy. In the case of Georgia, because of the ongoing territorial conflicts. But it doesn't mean, therefore, that we should be indifferent to their security. And we'll have to wait. We'll have to find alternative ways of dealing with them so that their security is enhanced. In the case of Ukraine, probably at the NATO summit in April, once a new president is in charge in the United States, and we can probably find alternative arrangements, either to the membership action plan or to some other aspects of the bilateral relationship so that the Ukrainians feel reassured. In the case of Georgia, we certainly will have to make some clear decisions regarding the nature of our stake in Georgia, and we cannot lose sight of the fact that if the Georgian government were to be overthrown, and right now it is totally vulnerable to an external use of force, the Baku-Ceyhan line would be cut, and thus our strategic access to Azerbaijan and the Caspian and Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan beyond would be similarly cut. Paradoxically, the financial crisis actually makes conditions for an improvement in relations with Russia surprisingly propitious. It's one thing when Russia collects $140 for a barrel of oil and can threaten, as it has on many occasions, to use it as a political tool, and has used it on many occasions, or when the barrel of oil produces less than $60, especially given the fact that so much of Russia's internal planning for the future has been based on the assumption of a fairly high price and continually growing demand. There are indications that what happened in Russia in the last few weeks has been a shock, probably to the entire Russian elite, including those at the very top. To them, more because they didn't anticipate the difficulties, probably resent them, and they know that many of their expectations and aspirations have to be reconsidered, and to a part of the elite in a much more direct fashion, because they have been busy over the last decade or so storing away money, not in Russian Vladivostok, or in Siberia, or in Kamchatka, or in the various East Russian cities that cry for development, or in Russian health service, in which 50% of its hospitals do not have hot water, but in Cayman Islands, in Cyprus, in London real estate, on the Riviera, and all of a sudden it dawned on them that if the American-European-Russian relationship were to deteriorate seriously, something could happen to these assets that would not be reassuring. All of that, I think, is nothing short of a very actually salutary lesson in the reality of interdependence. And that's the good. And that should facilitate meeting that particular task. The last, but by no means the least, is to pacify. It is to pacify. And that is to avoid, and that's particularly our responsibility, the growing risk that America will become militarily and politically bogged down in a vast area of the world ranging from east of Suez, does that phrase sound familiar to some of you? From east of Suez to west of India. From east of Suez to west of India. And nothing that I have said so far will accomplish anything if the U.S. does get bogged down. Because if we get bogged down, we will be in a protracted post-imperial war in the post-colonial age, which is not going to be easy to win with aroused populations that are not easy to control unless you're prepared to exterminate them, and we're not. And we'll be stuck, perhaps with escalating conflicts, resulting either from a reawakening of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to a continuation of the Iraqi war as an extension of a war with Iran, to a deepening war in Pakistan and Afghanistan. So let me say a brief word about each of these. And here, just as Europe, with our help, can more effectively deal with Russia, we have to deal with these problems but you can be more effective if you speak with one voice in giving us good advice and joining us in a responsible course of action, but not limiting yourself just to giving advice. I think we have to bite the bullet on the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, because we're probably within the last year in which a two-state solution is still feasible. Anybody who looks at the topography of the country and what's been happening in the West Bank, and one looks at demographics, one knows that that opportunity is slipping away. It's been slipping away for 41 years. It cannot continue slipping away on this or that excuse because one leadership is divided, another leadership is weak, or because something happens painfully on a human scale, but on a minuscule scale, actually, when the numbers are considered. And the only way this conflict will be resolved if the parties are helped to resolve it. And the only party that can help to resolve it, in the first instance, is the United States. And if the United States takes a clear position as to what are the essential, fundamental elements of a basic settlement, I have no doubt that the rest of the world will endorse it almost unanimously. I cannot think of a country that will dissent. And I think Israeli and Palestinian public opinions will be influenced once it is made explicit, because then it is much easier, much more difficult to stall, to evade. And that means it has to be done fairly soon, particularly at the highest level. And clarifying, for the record, something that instinctively most people affected in Israel and Palestine already know. Namely, there are four fundamental elements beyond which the process has to be negotiated, but which is the point of departure for negotiations and not an excuse for delaying these negotiations. And that is that the eventual Palestinian state will be demilitarized, perhaps with a NATO presence on its soil, or an American presence on the Jordan River to give Israel the strategic depth it says it needs for its security. Secondly, that the territorial settlement involves 1967 lines with equitable exchanges, one-on-one basis, permitting Israel to incorporate into Israel the heavily urbanized settlements on the fringes of the 67 lines, but with exchanges, compensation in the Negev and Galilee. And now, with increasing difficulty for the parties to swallow, in the case of the Palestinians, third, no right of return. No right of return for the Palestinian refugees, or rather their descendants, to what is Israel, because we cannot expect Israel to commit suicide for the sake of peace, demographic suicide. So no right of return. Yes, an acknowledgement of suffering. Yes, compensation. Yes, resettlement. But no right of return. And last but not least, a bitter pill for the Israelis to swallow, without which no peace would be viewed by the Palestinians as legitimate or enduring, because even visually it can be perceived as unfair. The sharing of Jerusalem. The sharing of Jerusalem as two capitals in one city. East Jerusalem, the Palestinian, West Jerusalem, the Israeli. Some fashion of arrangements for sharing the old city, and a Palestinian flag over the Golden Dome, which can be seen almost visually from anywhere in the Palestinian territory. With such a statement, the peace process will take off. And if I'm wrong, it will be no worse than it is, because it will remain stalled. And being stalled is not an enduring static condition. It's a prelude to renewed violence and disintegration in the region and radicalism.